My colleagues, it gives me a great pleasure to have our guest speaker here today. I had the pleasure of hearing a bit of what the speaker was talking about at the ETUS conference in Athens not that long ago. Unfortunately, he had nowhere near long enough to talk about the issue that he was talking about, but that issue in particular, I don't know if he's actually going to speak about that, I hope so, because it was a particularly important issue. So I hope that's what you're going to talk about. So I would like you all to welcome Professor Howard Stevenson, who's the head of training, ESRC, I've no idea what that stands for, Doctoral Training Programme, School of Education, University of Nottingham. That's some sign you're going to have on your door. I'd like to urge you to give us a warm welcome for the guest speaker.
President's Conference, it's an enormous privilege to have this opportunity to speak to you, and I'm conscious of how precious your time is at an event like this. To have the opportunity to talk about the issues that I am going to talk about, which are the same issues that I talked about in Athens, you'll be reassured to know, I'm very fortunate. And what I hope to do is to just sort of raise some questions to help us all think about, not just in a sense what are the issues that you want to address, but how as an organisation do you make sure that you've got the capacity to address them. Before I start, I do need to do something which I don't think I've ever done before, which is just to apologise for not being Frankie Boyle. If that's what you were hoping for or expecting, you'll be dreadfully disappointed, I know, but anyway, here I am, and talking about issues of union organisation. Technology works, brilliant. So I'm going to draw on research that I've been doing actually for many years, because what wasn't in the introduction was that I spent 15 years as a school teacher, roughly the same amount of time in higher education. When I was a school teacher, I was an activist in my union. I have an involvement in my current union in HE, and all that time I've been involved in researching issues around teacher unions and industrial relations, really born out of a conviction that teachers need to have a voice, and they only have that voice when they act collectively, which is what I've been hearing about actually all morning. Some of the work that I'm going to draw on is a report I did with a colleague for Education International. It's a set of international case studies in which what we looked at were unions in different parts of the world that were responding to a range of challenges, because we all of us recognise the world is changing, there are some very significant challenges confronting us, and some of them actually require, I think, a level of organisational change. And we've got to, I think, get better at learning from each other. And there's a lot of that work goes on, but maybe we could do it better. The report is on the Education International website. It's case studies from several countries. You can see them there. One of the case study unions was your colleague union, the EIS. So Scotland features in the report. In that report, our starting point was, in a sense, what are the issues that confront you? And you won't be surprised by the list that comes up here on this screen. I think I've heard almost all these issues being debated this morning. They're the preoccupations that confront your members, that confront you, and that confront your organisation. And it's not an accident when we put this list together that the item at the top is work intensification. It's the issue that I've heard more loudly and more clearly than probably any other this morning. It's a global phenomenon, actually, that teachers are experiencing. And partly, of course, because teachers are responding to the same global pressures. So I've heard some references in your debates to the OECD, and of course they are responsible for the global league table, which then puts the pressure on your politicians, that then puts the pressure into the system, which then cascades down and is experienced by teachers everywhere as the drive to work harder, and longer and to do better, and frankly to feel that they're never good enough and they're never able to work hard enough because the expectations are always rising. Now, I heard a commitment this morning to challenge that, and the remarks I'm not sure I would have heard south of Hadrian's Wall. It's a really difficult issue to do. Obviously it is, because it means sort of breaking that cycle that I've described of that sort of global accountability. But actually, if there's organised and collective pressure from the bottom up, then I think there's a possibility of doing it. I also heard this morning about the issue of deprofessionalisation. It was talked about as teacher agency, but a recognition, for many of the same reasons, that actually what teachers experience is more and greater control and intervention into how they teach, what they teach, how that teaching is judged, who judges that. It's experienced as a sort of loss of control over one's own work. And I've heard that a lot in your debates. The closing down of public and democratic spaces. One of the trade unions in the case study was Stevenson in Turkey. If you're familiar with that at all, you will know that educators in Turkey experience the most dreadful constraints on their activities because of an extremely authoritarian government. But in places very different to that, there are not so dissimilar pressures. I've heard this morning about how the union gets bypassed routinely. And this is something I think we see more and more. The culture of fear, the extent to which, in a sense, management pressures are being placed on teachers in a way that doesn't lend themselves to collective discussion, collegial discussion, but a sort of new managerialism, which means that the sort of collective way of organising previously is being challenged. Something that emerged strongly was the pressures of privatisation. I know these issues look very different in different parts of the world, and you're perhaps in a relatively advantaged position in Scotland, I know. But I'm going to make several references to south of Hadrian's Wall. It's where I come from, and I'm slightly sort of scarred by the experience, frankly. Any educator is. But of course, where we see these issues, the impact on teachers and their working lives is very, very considerable. And then something that we identified as rather vaguely as wider societal challenges. But a quote here from a General Secretary, and I think you sort of recognise the sentiment behind the statement. Teachers don't join a union instinctively in the way that my generation did. The sort of notion that there are sort of developments that are changing, maybe young people are different, and that this presents us with some difficulties. And I just sort of teased that out a little bit because I think some of these things have moved on and become a little bit clearer to us. There is a recognition that sort of traditional institutions that people might have felt an affiliation to actually are in decline. Political parties, trade unions. If you look at union membership outside of education, a very dramatic picture of decline. Actually, organised religion would be another example. Populations becoming more diverse, and how do our organisations represent them? This was originally growth of populism this morning, and then I heard the President's speech, and I thought, you know what, that needs stating rather more strongly. But a sort of notion that there's an anti-politics around, and that traditional institutions aren't giving people the answers that they wanted. The importance of social media, which can be easy to exaggerate sometimes, I think, but we need to recognise. If I was to give you an example of colleagues in Holland, where there was a sort of coming together of primary teachers on Facebook that gathered 40,000 people and actually became a significant challenge to the union. And actually, you know, the union was able to sort of bring the two groups together, but this was an entirely sort of spontaneous movement outside of the union and in a sense a direct challenge to the union, organised through social media. And then, of course, the rise of social movements and single-issue campaigns, maybe not the sorts of organisations that we're used to in the trade union and labour movement, but a reminder to us, actually, that for example, young people are interested in politics, they are interested in changing things, they are interested in working for change, but it's just maybe they don't see some of our more traditional institutions as the outlet for that activity. And that, I think, poses a pressure on all of us to think about, well, how do we change to bring those two things together? So those are some of the issues. What is the consequence of this? And what is the consequence of those pressures that I've just talked about? I've been hearing in your debates, the consequences of those challenges is the pressures on your members are rising inexorably. That means the pressure on your organisation is rising inexorably. What many people experience this as, actually, is increasing levels of casework. And in the English system, where the sort of performativity culture is very, very intense, I heard the reference to the performance-related pay issues that are a significant pressure in the system, then there's an explosion in the amount of capability-related work. So the union has a problem, which is the work that it's trying to deal with is growing enormously, and the resource that it has to deal with that issue is at best static, and it may actually be diminishing. So the pressures are going up, and you can't keep up with it. And what I want to argue, in a sense, is that's an unsustainable position. It might be tenable in the short run, but if that's the situation, it's not tenable in the long run. Because you're always chasing a sort of level of workload that you can't keep up with and that you don't have the resource. I think there's only one way to tackle that problem, and it's to identify the resource that you have, but that is always underutilised. And it's your own members. We have to find new ways of drawing members into the organisation. Actually, not only does that start to increase the resource, it gives you the collective capacity to tackle the problems. So it has the sort of virtuous arrangement of increasing the resource in a way that addresses the problems and is able to bring the problems down. And I'll give you a very practical example of that in a little while. But to me, that's an unsustainable position if it doesn't get addressed. What are the warning signs of it? They're these. You can see them there. The point I'd make is that the one people pay most attention to is often the last one to flag a problem, and that's membership. Membership of education unions, despite all the issues that we've got in the sort of wider movement, has remained pretty robust. Sometimes the membership levels on their own can look sort of pretty solid, but underneath, some of those other factors are deteriorating. And what I would argue, in a sense, is that where we see these signs, it's signalling a need to respond. And what I want to do is just identify three sort of areas where we can think about how we build organisations and how we build our unions. Just before I do that, a point that I want to make that came out very strongly from the research we did for Education International was about the importance of collective bargaining. And I've heard this morning and this afternoon about some of the challenges that you experience here. But when I looked at the countries that we studied, where collective bargaining is relatively robust, and the standout examples, I have to say, would be Scotland and would be New Zealand, then actually those education systems in those jurisdictions were not experiencing anything like the same levels of problems as other countries. And if I was to look at England and all that is happening there this morning, and it was brilliantly described by your president in his address, the start of those problems was in 1987 when collective bargaining was abolished. Teachers in England have not had national collective bargaining for all that time. And that was the start of the process of moving the union to the side so that the radical market-driven reforms that we now have in England have been able to be imposed. So I just wanted to take this opportunity in a sense to reiterate the point about defending and extending collective bargaining, because when you lose it, it's a real struggle to get it back, and when you lose it, the consequences are really substantial. So three ways of thinking about building our organisations. You'll be familiar with lots of this. It's just a way of sort of, I think, helping think about these issues. And of course, the central question, the central problem, is balancing dealing with what's immediately in front of you and needs your attention, and then thinking about how to develop a longer term and strategic perspective. And sometimes there's a tension between those. And we understandably focus on what's right in front of us. Sometimes we need to step back and think longer term. This is just a way of thinking about some issues that I think are about long term change. What I'm going to call organising at the workplace, organising everyone, and organising around ideas. Never know what reaction this slide's going to get. Don't know how clearly you can see it. Right, but I'll explain it. This was a piece of work I actually did for the NUT, and they were interested in questions of member engagement. To what extent are members of the union engaged in it, connected with it, feel sort of an identity with it? And one of the things we did was we carried out a survey of members, or some members, a sample of members. 46 survey questions. There's 26 statements on here. Right, these were the survey questions that have a statistical relationship between them. Right, the other questions were sort of useful and important, but they didn't have a statistical relationship in the same way. So the point is, these questions, they scale together, right? They pattern together. This doesn't get any more complicated than this, so I'm not a mathematician, I've just got a way of explaining this. So we find these things together. Right. The statement at the bottom, the union exists for teachers like me, right, is the easiest question for people to say yes to. Right? The union exists for teachers like me is the easiest question for people to say yes to. The item at the top, I regularly attend local association meetings, is the item people found it most difficult to say yes to. Right? The item that they were least likely to say yes to. Right? Remember that the local association meeting is the basic democratic unit of the union. And actually people are saying that was the hardest thing for them to say yes to. As my co-researcher on this, who's not involved in union work, said at the time, she's American, and she said, blimey, she said, you're a bit weird if you go to union meetings. Because the point was, it was quite unusual in the responses. Right, the really clever bit of this is, and the reason why this is a triangle, is because if you say yes to the top question, you're very likely to say yes to virtually everything underneath it. Right? If you say yes to something halfway up, but maybe not above it, you're very likely to have said yes to everything underneath it, and very unlikely to say yes to anything above it. So what it does is it creates like a measure. If I say yes to the top question, I'm very highly engaged in the union. If my sort of highest point is towards the bottom, I've got a much lower level of engagement with the union. It sort of gives us a measure of engagement. We could spend an awful lot of time talking about what the individual sort of responses might tell us about whether people engage with social media, whether it makes any impact. That people do engage with the union, but not necessarily through the more formal structures of branch meetings. Lots of interesting comment in that. But I suppose the question that's really valuable to us is, well, what's the factor that determines whether people are higher up the scale? Because if people are higher up the scale, they're more engaged, they're more connected, they're more likely to participate in union activity. So what factor might have a relationship to where people feature on that scale? And let me tell you, there was only one factor that had a highly statistically significant relationship between that factor and whether people were higher up the scale or lower down the scale. One factor. Anybody want to think what it might be? Age made almost no difference. It's interesting, isn't it? Made almost no difference. Sorry?
Bolshevism.
Bolshevism. Right, we didn't ask people to self-identify as Bolsheviks in the survey, but that is constructive feedback, and when we do the next iteration, it will be there. But actually, you're not a million miles away, possibly, of a sort. The one factor, having a workplace rep. Having a workplace rep. So what you get is a sort of distribution, if this works. Imagine a distribution that goes like that, being turned on its side to fit the scale. That's the distribution without the rep, and that's the distribution with the rep. It's the one factor that made that difference. And I would argue that's because when you have a rep, people see the union, they connect with the union becomes real in their workplace. And that's decisive. What I also said to the NUT who commissioned the work is the one factor that makes a difference is the factor you've got some control over. You can recruit more reps. I'm not saying it's easy, it's difficult, but you can recruit more reps. You can support those reps you have to take on a more active role and to take on more representation. So I heard this morning, I think it was Catherine, ask a question to the First Minister, Deputy First Minister. What's the one thing that you've seen from your trips around schools that would help address workload? Well, I have an answer to that question, and it's a very clear answer. You make sure you've got a union rep in the workplace, because that's the issue that makes a difference. And when the President said to the Deputy First Minister, because of my teacher agency, if I think something is actually professionally not the right thing to do with students, are you telling me I can turn around and say no? And of course the answer wasn't that you could turn around and say no. And of course you can't turn around and say no, because you're on your own. And saying no when you're on your own is really difficult, because of all those pressures in the school, the culture of fear that is sometimes there and which is a sort of growing feature of our workplaces. So saying no on your own is not possible. Teacher agency is really important. I believe in it passionately, but I've written about this, that it can never be only individual. Teacher agency only becomes meaningful when it's collective. So actually, if we want to make teacher agency something meaningful, you have to act together to say no to that question, to that imposition. And I think the way that that is most likely to happen is in a workplace when people are organised together, because actually so many of these decisions are made in workplaces. They're individual workplace decisions. There are decisions made high up, but the reality, the reality of your lives as teachers is a lot of those individual decisions that add to my workload are actually decisions made in the workplace. They have to be challenged at the workplace. And when people do that, people see the union making a difference, their commitment to it increases, and on that scale, right, they start to participate in more and more things. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to move on to the other two factors. But if you said to me, what's the one thing that a union ought to do when confronting the sorts of challenges that face members, I would always now answer, develop workplace presence. Make sure that you have a rep in every school. That should be the aspiration. Actually, think about whether you ought to have 2 reps in every school, because in a culture of fear, being that one person is a really difficult thing. How can we help people take on that work? Well, sometimes it's having more people do it. And then how do you support those people to not just do that work in a sort of, at a sort of low level of activity, but to have the confidence to take on more representational work. It's the one key factor. But a couple of other issues to think about, and just, to move on. Something else is to think about our own organisations and the way we do our work, and particularly as our workforce becomes more diverse, whether the organisation reflects that diversity, for example. So, I said earlier that in that survey, the easiest thing for people to say was that the union exists for teachers like me, sort of very strong sort of sense of affinity there. But in the same piece of work, when I was interviewing some young teachers, somebody made this comment. And it was a reference about going to a union meeting and just feeling that actually, as they sat there and observed the meeting, as a young teacher, classroom teacher, their observation of that meeting at that time was that it didn't sort of reflect who they thought they were and wasn't addressing the issues that they thought were important. And a sort of notion that there's sometimes a disconnect between the way we do our work and how people experience that from the outside. And whether there's sometimes different ways of doing things that might make the organisation more welcoming and more inclusive. And actually, I think we have a lot to learn here from the newer social movements that work a lot with young people and work in very, very different ways. Here's a comment. This is from a completely different study, actually, that I was involved in, but the quote illustrates the point. And I spoke at a union branch meeting just earlier this week, actually. I was invited to speak at a meeting. And I just reflected on it that there were 30 people at the meeting. It was quite a well-attended branch meeting. But as I thought about it afterwards, I think there were probably about 7 people who spoke at the meeting all evening. There was a woman sat 2 seats away from me. She came to the meeting on her own. She didn't speak to anybody during the meeting, and then she left at the end of the evening without having spoken to anybody. And I just wondered whether she would come back again. She may well do, but she went because she was interested. She wouldn't have gone if she wasn't interested. It was a meeting, it was after school. It was she had to travel from her school to the meeting. There was a commitment there. I'm sure she would have actually been willing to undertake some sort of activity or get involved or want to make some sort of contribution. Why else would you go to a union meeting? But I just wonder whether actually she came and went, and that possibility of drawing her in was never really taken advantage of. And maybe we need to think more about how we work, which is more inclusive in that way. And I'm reporting this as things that have been said to me by people through the research that I've been involved in, and I'm saying it as someone who's thought about meetings that I've been involved in and I've chaired, and I absolutely recognise that I've done these things really, really badly. It's not about somebody sort of preaching about people doing things wrong. It's about recognising how sometimes we all need to sort of step back and think how we do things and whether we can do them differently. And if we're just talking to ourselves about this sometimes, then the very people we're trying to reach out to are not even part of that conversation. Final point, and an example from my own union, but I've called it organising around ideas. I heard the Deputy First Minister this morning talk about the importance of professional development. And professional development is really about investing in ourselves in order to be more effective in the work that we do. And I wonder whether we take that side of union work as seriously as we might. Because what I'm talking about, I think, is having to put some serious effort and resource into how we bring people into the organisation and then develop them. And that requires actually quite some commitment. Resources are a problem, I understand that. It's a sort of sense of prioritising. It's that tension between the short term and what you need to do with what's right in front of you, but also having a longer term perspective. The example I'm giving here is a programme that UCU run, which I have some involvement in. It's called Transforming UCU. I just give it as one example of how a union is actually thinking about how does it build up a sort of long-term programme for developing activists. So participants in this programme attend 2 events, they're 2 days each, but in between time there's a project that they work on, they get mentored with that. I understand there's resource issues around all of this, but it's an example of the sort of strategic thinking about how to bring people into the organisation and how to develop people and give people the skills and confidence to take on more work in the organisation. And these things, we do these things, but maybe we need to do more of it. And I did hear the President this morning talk about educate, agitate and organise. And I do think that the education and development of our own members is often actually the bit of that is most sort of neglected. So in conclusion, and to finish up, I think what I'm talking about is the need for us to sometimes think about cultural change in an organisation. And that's a very difficult thing for a union to do because cultural change is big, it's difficult, it's long term, and those issues that confront you and your members are right in front of you and need dealing with now. The fact that you've given me a slot in your conference agenda tells me that there's an interest in sort of engaging in this discussion and what these issues look like. That's a part of a process. I'm sure you've been having these conversations for some time. I hope this has helped just maybe frame thinking what that might look like. But we need to think about these things, I think, with a much longer term perspective, because if we don't, those pressures that I talked about earlier risk sort of coming at us and just washing over us and almost drowning us. If the casework goes through the roof and all you can do is struggle to keep up with it, that's just hanging on by your fingernails. It's not a strategic response to tackling those issues. To build the capacity to do that often requires a sort of way of rethinking what we do and how we do it. I hope that's just sort of helped frame some of those issues. It's not presented in any way as this is what to do, but it is about having a collective discussion about how we might do that, I think. Thank you very much.